Hi, this is Steve Eulberg for JamPlay, and in our Music Theory 101 lessons, we're now taking a look at scales and modes. For some people, this is the thing that makes them fall asleep. For some people, it makes them scared. For some, like me, it was a frustrating thing that I just struggled to understand, and it turns out I knew more than I thought, I knew less than I thought, and I was confused by most of it. So I hope that in this lesson, we'll be able to clear that up. Let's start off this way. We all are born, now if you don't wear glasses this doesn't work for you, but we're all born in the diatonic world. Well, first off, we're born in a world that doesn't have any framework. Every sound we hear is sound. We gradually be able to group things into tones that we can recognize, and when we start singing songs like hot cross buns, or lullaby and good night, sleep, my child. I'm singing the songs that many of us heard as the first music we heard, which was lullabies from our parents being rocked to sleep. We began to hear distinct pitches, and they always related to scale tones in what became known in the singing world as solfeggio, another Italian word, or solfege, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Before it was written down and given that name, they were still distinct pitches that were the building blocks that all of Western music is built on. And songs use those tones. Somewhere in the 1415, 1600s, somewhere around in there, people began to fill in the gaps because each one of these scales, if you do the scale tones, and it has to do with a mathematical thing, you have do, re, mi, fa, sol, do, so, do, so, do, so, do. You have these, we call them scales, but there were 7 steps in the scale, but they were not all mathematically even. The first 2 had a space. The second 2 had a space. The third 2, skinny space. Then, and you can see this on a piano keyboard if you want to compare it to there. Start at C, and there's a black key between C and D. Between D and E, there's a black key. Between E and F, no black key. There's skinny space. Between F and G, black key. G and A, black key. A and B, black key. Between B and C again, no black key. Skinny space. They came to, and there were 7 steps that made up all the scales, and the songs were based on that. But then people started thinking mathematically, I wonder what happened if we put something, play the note that's in between there, and make it all even. And so they had 7 steps, they filled in all the gaps, and now there were 12 steps. You might have heard of a thing called a 12-tone scale. That's what it is. If you play on the guitar, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, whoops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then I get to the last one. That's the doubling of the first one, the octave. Now, if I play that diatonically, that's like this, no sharps or flats. That's how I get there. That's where I'm skipping some and filling in. And that's where some people get confused about guitar. There's all these frets and you spend most of your time trying to skip some frets. On the piano, they shortened those extra notes and made them a different color so that they're out of the way and you can skip them if you want to, you can use them if you need to. So that's a little bit of what's different between the guitar and the piano and why some people wrestle with that. But the key thing I want us to pay attention to is the diatonic scale is like kids going up and down the steps in school with the safety patrol saying, don't skip steps. The diatonic scale is skipping steps. The chromatic scale is what the safety patrol wants you to do. Step on every step. And we live in the chromatic world. We live in the world that assumes there are 12 steps in every scale. But we were, as people in the West and as children as we come up, we don't sing all the notes all the time. We tend to sing songs that are in the diatonic world. They tend to follow certain scale patterns, and there are ones that we use for these kinds of songs, one we use for those kind of songs. That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, there are 2 points of intersection between these two worlds. There are 2 scales that are exactly the same. In the modal world, the diatonic world with no glasses, and the chromatic world, the world with the 12 tones. So 7-tone world, 12-tone world. It's the best way that I can describe. I'm always looking at the diatonic world through my 12-tone world experience and framework. So I will look at a piece and say, what key is this in? And the diatonic answer may be, it's in the Dorian mode. And I'll say, but what key is that in? Keys belong to the glasses. They belong to the chromatic world. Dorian says, it's in Dorian of D. Whenever you have Dorian of D, it's going to sound like this. So we need to have a better understanding of how these talk to each other. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The names of the modes come from Greek names. Whether or not they are the actual Greek modes that the Greeks used, we don't know for sure. There's some suspicion that we're close to them, but the names are named for Greek things. That's why they sound a little unusual to English ears, for example. But the Ionian mode is exactly the same as the major scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Now, if you don't have the black keys, or you don't have those chromatic notes, it became the convention that C was always the major scale. Without the black keys, if you start on a C and play the white keys of the piano, you always get a C major scale. You always get the Ionian mode. So that became associated with, if it's in major, it's in C. Now what happens though is, and that's the familiar 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4. 4, 3, 1, 4, 2, 1, 4, 2. That pattern of playing is the Ionian mode. It's also called the major scale. If you start on the second step of that scale and play all the same notes but go beyond that and start on re, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, re, you get the Dorian scale. It's built on the second degree of the scale or the second step of the scale. It changes, the half steps and whole steps didn't change between the notes, but it changes the orientations of the notes to each other. So instead of having a major third first, we've got a minor third. And it became a convention that Dorian was in D. Does that make sense? It's one of the minor modes, and it has no complete parallel in the chromatic world. The Dorian mode is sometimes called mountain minor by some people. And actually in the United States there are some mountain tunes which preserve the Dorian mode very well. There's also some English folk tunes that do that, like Drunken Sailor. What do we do with a drunken sailor? What do we do with a drunken sailor? What do we do with a drunken sailor early in the morning? And are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. That note right there, that tells you we're in the Dorian mode. Remember me to one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine. If you don't have that note in there, you can't sing the song. It doesn't sound right to do what would be called minor. Are you going to Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. No. That's not the song. The song lives in the other mode, and it needs the other mode. And there is a key signature goes with it. It looks the same as the Ionian key signature. So there are no sharps and flats in D Dorian. You play all the white keys again, you just start and end at D. If that worked, what happens if we start at the third degree of the scale, or the third step of the scale, and play past Do again? We get a whole different one. That's kind of weird, isn't it? There's a flatted second to begin with. one's called the Phrygian mode. We don't hear a lot in that mode in these days. But it is, what's interesting to note is if you've ever watched Star Trek, the TV show from back in the 1960s, every time they went into the future, they ended up in the past. They ended up in the classical Greek. They'd go to countries or planets where people wore togas and had silver laurel leaves in their hair and stuff like that. And they played harps and they played modal music. And what's interesting to me too is jazz at the same period was using modes as its way of understanding and trying to figure out what's going on in music and exploring and having fun by limiting themselves to just working with the notes of the mode. So that's the Phrygian mode if you start on the 3rd degree of the scale and use all the same steps. If we're using C as our example on the keyboard, E was associated with Phrygian. Now let's start with the 4th degree. That's F. That's Lydian. It's got a sharp 4. Sounds very bright. Sounds very bright. Now if we start at the 5th degree of the scale, we've got Mixolydian. People often get this confused and call it Mixolydian. And I always remind them there's a TV channel called Nickelodeon. We're talking about Mixolydian. If you start on that degree, you're going to have a flatted 7th at the top, and that's when songs start being called modal. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, te, la, sol, fa, mi, re. You heard that last ba ba ba, it wasn't dee dee, it was te do. And the songs that live in that mode have to have that note. People will play that and say, that's wrong. No, it's just the Mixolydian way of being right. So that is Mixolydian. What if we start on the 6th step of the scale? We've come to the other point of connection between the modal world and the diatonic world. Now we're in the Aeolian mode, which is called the minor scale, pure or natural minor scale, when you're talking about the chromatic world. And that's the one that I played when I got Scarborough Fair wrong, because that's the one we assumed to be the minor scale. Now, when you get into the chromatic world, there are many, many, many minor scales. I like to call them free-range critters. But in the modal world, there are 2 that are more minor. You've got the Dorian mode. You've got the Aeolian mode. After that, everything has a minor 3rd in it, but the diminished one that's got that flatted 5th, the Locrian mode, we haven't even gotten there yet. We have one more left, don't we? Ha! Better do that. If we start on the 7th step of the scale, or 7th degree, starting at T-Do, T-Do, we've got the Locrian mode, which is sometimes called the diminished mode because it has a flatted 5th in it. That one doesn't get used that often, but it's a very interesting one. And may have some similarities with modes in Bali or other places where they have a minor 2nd as a natural thing. There's just so many different ways music can connect around the world. One way of paying attention to this, I've got it in the supplemental content, is a chart that shows you what's the new changed note, or what's the defining note in each mode. So you can say, oh yeah, if I have that one, that'll be a way of knowing which one I'm in. Now, the other thing that's possible, because we live in this chromatic world, when you only had the diatonic world and C was always the one and D was always the other, you couldn't play another mode using that. Although guitars that had tied-on frets, I've seen some of these in museums, they could shift the frets in order to change what modes you were doing. You could shift and play. Oh, okay, I moved it a little bit. That got me the mode I wanted. what we can do, because we have these chromatic frets on here, is just like on the piano, you add different black keys. It's possible to play every single mode with every single key signature. So now I can start anywhere and play any one of the modes. That's why I think we get overwhelmed with it and we don't quite understand it. When it was in the diatonic world, it made sense. We start here, we get that. We start there, we get that. And we use the one we want. But it doesn't always match your voice. It doesn't always match the other instruments you want to play with. So having the flexibility of having all the notes is very helpful. It can also be very confusing. That's why we're doing these, so we can try to sort through the confusion. Now, I told you that minor scales, there's lots of them, and they're free-range critters, but there are a few that show up more often, particularly in Western music. And you'll run into musicians who'll say, that wasn't the minor scale that I played before. They like this one. It's called the harmonic minor. The other one, the Aeolian mode, the natural minor, doesn't have enough pull in it, they say. So in the chromatic world, we have the natural minor, we have the harmonic minor, and then there's the melodic minor. The melodic minor goes up one way and comes down the other way, if that's not confusing enough. So when someone says, I want to play the minor scale, I'm always wanting to know a little bit more about which scale they want to play, because there are several to choose from. Now, each mode has a particular quality to it, or one way you can do this is to play through the modes and hear the quality that some people refer to it as lightness and darkness, or brightness and darkness. The Lydian mode is the brightest. That has the sharp 4. Then the Ionian mode is the next one. Incidentally, the Greeks ascribed different qualities to each one of the modes, and this one was called the light and frivolous one, suitable for bacchanalian orgies. The Ionian mode, which we call the major scale and we use for almost everything now. Then we have one flat, and what starts to happen is, now after the Ionian mode, we start lowering one note in each scale, and just like with key signatures, we keep the ones that were lowered before. So I'm gonna have the Dorian mode. And what I did was change my fingering position for that. For the Lydian mode, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4. For the Ionian mode, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4. For the Dorian mode, I shifted positions and started 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1. For the Aeolian mode, I shift and put my first finger on the note. 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3. The next darkest we're going to have is the Phrygian mode, and I'm going to lower the second. So it's 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3. Then I'm going to lower the fifth. So it's 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3. You can hear they get progressively. It's so interesting to try to describe sound in language, and it's so common to use visual terminology. So it goes from light to dark. That's what we did there. Now I'm going to go from dark to light. The Locrian mode, now the Phrygian mode. Now Aeolian mode. Now Dorian mode, Ionian mode, and Lydian mode. One traditional way that the modes were paid attention to was if you start on C, D, E, you get that mode no matter what happens. That's one way of playing them. The other way is when I stayed in A and played all the modes related to A. And it's possible to play all the modes with a single key signature. I mentioned there was going to be a rule to break or an exception to the rule when I was talking about key signatures. Here's one of the things that you need to pay attention to when you're trying to decode a song. If there's no sharps and flats and the last note of the song is a C, we're probably playing in the key of C. However, if there's no sharps and flats and the last note of the song is a D, we're probably playing in Dorian of D, because Dorian of D has no sharps and flats. If we're playing a note that has no sharps and flats and we end in an A, we're probably playing in Aeolian of A. Same with all the other modes. And no matter what key signature we have, if the last note, because almost every song ends at home, is not the home note, you might be looking for a different mode. And that's what helps me decode songs when I'm trying to learn them by ear. I'm trying to read music and say, no, what's going on in here? Why is this one, we're not at home. We're in one of the other modes. So that's how I find the transition between the modal world and the chromatic world to make best sense for me. I hope that helps you understand it better too. There are several different examples in the supplemental content to compare modes and key signatures to illustrate what I'm talking about. And you can figure that out for yourself. You can take one that is not included and see if you can figure it out. If you have questions, go ahead and ask. That's fine. Well, I hope this has helped you understand this and you didn't just have your eyes glaze over. If you need to go back and watch it a few times, that's fine. It's taken me a while. This has been a tough nut for me to crack. But if you look at several other lessons in the JamPlay site, you'll find that several people love to use different modes in their soloing. And they base a lot of what they're doing on understanding what's happening here. So I believe this can help you too. We'll see you next time.